A flight attendant tried to restrain a baby mid-flight. When the CEO warned him to stop, ignoring it led to consequences he never saw coming. A flight attendant reached for the baby with zip ties, thinking he could restrain an innocent child without consequences. He didn't realize the CEO father would only ward him once before the entire cabin turned into a reckoning. The moment those ties clicked, his career snapped with them. Subscribe if you believe arrogance collapses the instant real authority speaks. Sir, I'll need to inspect a child for safety compliance. The words came quietly, almost politely, yet their effect struck like a drop weighed in still water. Dr. Kalen Ryden looked up, startled but calm, his eyes locking onto the man standing just inches from him in the narrow aisle of Aries Line Flight 907. The man wore a regulation flight attendant's uniform press collar, name badge clipped at a slight angle, but it was the expression beneath the neat grooming that stood out. Not kindness, not concern, calculation. The man's nameplate read Rennickthale. Kalen tightened his grip slightly on the soft chest carrier that held his 6-month-old son, Laron, who was just beginning to stir with the vibration of the plane's engines. The boy's head rested delicately against his father's chest, rising and falling with each breath, the tiny oxygen sensor blinking in a soft blue rhythm just beneath the carrier's edge. The movement calmed Kalen, but only for a moment. Is there an issue? Kalen asked, voice composed, barely above a whisper. Rennick's practiced smile remained fixed, but it didn't reach his eyes. Just a routine compliance inspection, he replied, brushing an invisible speck off his sleeve. We need to ensure all infants are secured according to current FAA standards. Kalen's eyes didn't waver. This carrier meets those standards. In fact, it exceeds them. The medical tag is visible, oxygen monitor equipped, spine-stabilized harness. It's cleared for high-altitude use. Rennick's gaze dropped to the yellow tag stitched into the side of the carrier, a bright MED6 clearance seal from the National Infant Respiratory Board. His jaw moved slightly, but he said nothing. Kalen could see it now, recognition, not of the tag, but of something else, a contradiction. He didn't know how to challenge yet. From across the aisle, a junior attendant with thin-frame glasses and a nervous brow looked over. He held a digital tablet against his chest, its screen pulsing with a faint orange light. Kalen didn't notice the color until later, but Rennick already had. That glow meant his seat had been flagged. I'm sorry, sir, Rennick said, tone unchanged or firmer. We've had a few updates to procedure. I just need a quick check. Something shifted behind the man's words, not policy, but intention. Kalen had negotiated across boardrooms with billion-dollar firms, had calmed panic investors during system malfunctions, had read in a person's tone when a question was merely a test of submission. He felt that now. This wasn't about safety. This was about control. Still, he said nothing. Laron stirred again, letting out a soft sigh. Kalen lowered his eyes to the child briefly, centering himself. Of course, he said evenly, but I will remain with him at all times. Rennick hesitated. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, a blink too long, a breath too short. Then he nodded curtly and walked away, brushing past the junior attendant, who turned his tablet slightly to shield it from Kalen's view. The aisle returned to its quiet hum. Passengers nearby looked up only briefly, then turned back to books, headphones, idle conversation. No one had noticed the moment's subtle wrongness, but Kalen had. He shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting the carrier, stroking the side of Laron's head. The baby's breathing steadied again. Just minutes earlier, the boarding had been smooth. A calm flight, a direct route to Norvale City where a pediatric specialist awaited them. This was not a vacation. This was a necessity. Laron's condition, chronic neonatal apnea, required monitoring, soft handling, and minimal jostling during ascent. Kalen had planned every variable. What he hadn't planned for was a man like Rennickthale. He glanced toward the galley at the front. Rennick stood there, leaning slightly toward the younger attendant, Jaren Vale. His name tag read, whispering. Jaren's eyes darted nervously back toward Kalen and Laron, then down, then back again. Behind them, the cabin lights flickered faintly as the plane hit a small pocket of turbulence. Not enough to draw concern, just a single shiver through the fuselage, but enough to shift the mood. Kalen felt it deep in his chest. From the edge of his vision, he saw Rennick swipe a finger across the crew interface screen near the galley bulkhead. Another quiet alert. Another tap. Kalen's name, Ryden Kalen J., probably already nestled in a drop-down menu labeled Monitor, Uncooperative, or worse. Dramatic irony wound itself into the silence. Kalen, who had spent years building trust systems and aviation networks, software to de-escalate passenger threats before they began, was now being watched as one. He remembered something a colleague once told him during a development trial. Sometimes the glitch isn't the code. It's the person who decides what the code means. That memory returned as he watched Rennick's back stiffen, his hand lingering too long over a zip tie clip fastened to his utility belt. The turbulence settled, but the feeling did not. Kalen gently pressed 2 fingers to Laron's monitor node. Still stable. Still calm. Then came the final movement, the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving back toward his row. Kalen looked up once more. Rennick stood over him again, posture controlled, voice even. "Sir, I'll need to inspect the child for safety compliance." And with those words, casually spoken, falsely benign, the narrative shifted. It was the first sign that something on this flight was dangerously out of place. Rennick Thale's hand hovered near the edge of the carrier strap, like a vulture sizing up something fragile and alive. His voice, though controlled, carried an unsettling undertone. "I'll need to inspect the infant's medical carrier more closely. There may be a compliance error." Kalen Ryden did not blink. He shifted slightly in his seat, shielding 6-month-old Laron with a subtle turn of his shoulder. "You've already seen the tag," he said calmly, his voice low and even. "It's been cleared for transit, and I've reviewed the compliance certificate myself." Sudden movements can destabilize his breathing cycle. But Rennick didn't back away. Instead, he leaned in further, his lips twitching with the faintest expression of doubt. Not about the documentation, but about the man holding it. His eyes scanned Kalen, not for truth, but for defiance. Passengers in nearby rows looked up, some with polite curiosity, others with faint unease, like people sensing a fire before the smoke arrives. One older man adjusted his glasses, but said nothing. Another shifted in his seat and looked away. Rennick stepped back a few inches, then tilted his head and gestured toward the carrier. "It needs to be resecured." His words were wrapped in the polished language of procedure, but his tone sharpened at the edges, more command than concern. Kalen took a steady breath. "The carrier is stabilized per medical protocol. Resecuring it in any other fashion risks airflow misalignment. If you need confirmation, I can show you the diagnostic file from the pediatric pulmonology team." Rennick's brow furrowed. He didn't ask to see it. He didn't even pretend to check. Instead, he turned slightly toward the galley and tapped twice on the wall panel, activating a small crew-only interface embedded behind the doorframe. A quiet chime echoed through the cabin's comm system, too soft for most passengers to register consciously. But Kalen heard it, and he recognized the code. He had once helped design the interface it came from. An internal alert had been sent. From the aisle behind him, the junior attendant, Jaron Vale, emerged with hesitant steps. He looked barely old enough to vote, and his voice came out in a nervous whisper. "Rennick, I checked the system tag. It might have pulled the seat flag from 12C. There's a glitch." Rennick silenced him with a look so sharp it could have drawn blood. "You're not cleared for passenger dispute resolution," he snapped under his breath. Jaron retreated a step, his eyes darting to Kalen, then back to the floor. Inside Kalen's mind, the sequence of events rearranged itself into a new shape, one he didn't like. The false flag, the alert tone, the refusal to acknowledge medical status. This wasn't about safety. It was about something else. Power, control, reputation. He had seen men like Rennick in boardrooms, clinging to protocols like shields, weaponizing procedures when arguments failed. The only difference was that those men didn't have zip ties clipped to their belts. Rennick stepped forward again, this time closer than before. "Sir," he said louder, just enough for others to hear, "refusing a compliance check is grounds for onboard enforcement." The air thickened around them. A few passengers looked up, more alert now. No one intervened. Kalen met Rennick's gaze without blinking. I am not refusing. I'm insisting that any inspection be conducted without detaching the carrier from my body. You don't have medical clearance to handle a respiratory unit. Rennick's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Then Kalen saw them. 3 zip ties looped and clipped neatly along the edge of Rennick's utility belt. White plastic. Standard issue. Not meant for infants. Not medically approved, but legal under the vague umbrella of situational restraint. That was when Kalen's objective shifted. This wasn't about procedure anymore. It was about protection. His son was no longer just a passenger. He was a target, and the man standing above them had already made up his mind. Rennick muttered something under his breath, too low for others to catch, but Kalen caught it. If you don't comply, I'll take control of the situation myself. The words weren't said like a threat. They were said like a vow. Kalen adjusted Laron's blanket with deliberate calm, concealing the rising fury beneath his stillness. He had negotiated billion-dollar defense contracts with less tension than what now filled this narrow aisle. He could feel the plane soften beneath his feet, the quiet rhythm of flight in progress. But the real turbulence was here, 36,000 feet above ground, wrapped in faux professionalism and one man's unchecked sense of power. Across the aisle, a teenage boy lifted his phone slightly, pretended to text but quietly recording. The passengers didn't fully understand what was happening. Not yet, but they felt it. The air had shifted. And Rennick? He was still standing too close, still watching too intently, still preparing for an incident that hadn't occurred yet. Kalen's breath slowed. He scanned Rennick's posture, the flicker in his fingers, the way he kept one hand near his belt. He was going to reach for the baby. And when he did, everything would change. It was the moment Kalen realized that this was not a misunderstanding. It was the beginning of a trap. Rennick's hand hovered inches from the infant's carrier, fingers flexed with unsettling confidence. When Kalen reached up, calm but firm, and blocked the motion with his forearm. The touch wasn't aggressive, but the message was unmistakable. His eyes met Rennick's with unblinking clarity. "No," Kalen said. One word. Controlled. Final. A beat of silence followed, thick and stretched. Passengers in the adjacent rows, once dozing or reading, now sat motionless, caught in that silent wait between civility and confrontation. Rennick recoiled slightly, blinking as if surprise or resistance came without volume. His lips curled. "You're interfering with safety protocols," he declared loudly, letting his voice carry up the aisle like a signal flare. Several passengers flinched. Someone dropped their magazine. Kalen didn't raise his voice. "You have no legal cause to touch my son. He has medical clearance. You have the file." His tone was even, yet every syllable struck like a steel note. He didn't move from his seat, but the quiet tension in his posture, legs planted, one hand resting protectively across the carrier, radiated unmistakable intent. Rennick stepped back, face flushed, breathing fast. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned to the intercom beside the galley partition, pressed a code, and lifted the handset. "This is Thale in mid-cabin," he said. "Requesting presence of onboard security marshal immediately. Passenger resisting inspection. Behavior erratic." The line went silent as he replaced the receiver. Then, from the front of the aircraft, steady footsteps began making their way toward them, each one sounding like the click of a locking mechanism in Kalen's mind. Officer Red Varsun arrived within moments. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried a presence that filled the aisle before he even spoke. His uniform bore the emblem of Federal Air Compliance, and his face wore the cold neutrality of someone long trained in appearing impartial, though behind his eyes there flickered a trace of something personal. Red had dealt with Kalen's type before, wealthy, composed, always sure they were above regulation. At least, that was how he'd told the story to himself before. "What's the issue?" Red asked, arms folded as he surveyed the scene. Rennick stepped forward, hands gesturing in the air as if assembling a narrative from pieces he'd rehearsed. Passenger was uncooperative during standard compliance check. Refused inspection of the infant carrier. Raised his voice. Made a threatening motion. "That's false," Kalen interjected, still seated, still calm. "I advise the crew that my son has a respiratory condition requiring continuous positional monitoring." Any jostling of the carrier could endanger his breathing. I've explained this twice and provided documentation. He retrieved a medical file from the side compartment of his carry-on, offering it out with practiced efficiency. Red took it, glanced at the top line, but said nothing. He didn't open it. "I'll need to verify that later," Red replied. His tone was flat, but there was no urgency in his hands, no movement to actually read the file. Instead, he looked back at Rennick and asked, "Is the child properly secured for restraint if needed?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Kalen's spine stiffened. He recognized the phrasing. Not a question of safety, not a question of well-being. A procedural line buried deep in the crew training logs, used only when considering escalation. Rennick didn't respond immediately. He was watching Kalen now, not with caution, but calculation. The game had changed. With Red here, he no longer needed to justify his actions to the passengers. He had the arm of the law beside him, or so he believed. The baby stirred in the carrier, a soft sound, followed by a cough, dry and shallow. Kalen instinctively adjusted the padding beneath Laron's head, his eyes never leaving the two men before him. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Subtle, electric. A few passengers leaned forward, one man glancing nervously toward the nearest call button. A voice from across the aisle broke through. "Excuse me," a middle-aged man said, raising his hand slightly. "I've been watching this. The father hasn't done anything wrong." Red's eyes flicked toward him, then away, without acknowledgement. Silence settled again. Rennick placed a hand near his waist, fingers brushing the small nylon loop that held the zip ties on his belt. A silent promise of what was coming. Kalen breathed in. The internal machinery of his mind spun faster now, calculating. He noted Red's body position, the way his weight leaned slightly toward Rennick. The alignment was clear. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be guided by protocol. It would be driven by control. "Let me be clear," Kalen said, rising half an inch in his seat, not enough to provoke, but just enough to anchor the room's attention. "You have no authority to restrain a child without a specific and immediate safety threat. There is no such threat here. If you attempt to do so, you will be personally liable for harm caused." Red didn't answer. Rennick stepped forward again. His fingers curled around the first zip tie, letting it click once as if to signal that the time for negotiation was over. The marshal stayed in place, unmoving, his arms crossed like a spectator, deciding when to intervene, if at all. Kalen didn't flinch. But in that instant, his objective was no longer just about keeping his son safe. It was about understanding the line these men were willing to cross, and preparing to meet them at its edge. It was clear now that the threat was real, and Kalen would have only one chance to stop it. His hand shot out toward the baby with a startling sense of ownership, the other lifting a zip tie already curved between his fingers like a snake coiled mid-strike. Kalen reacted instantly, his entire body pivoting as he shielded the infant carrier with one arm and stepped backward, voice firm but measured. "Stop." The single word, unraised, unfaltering, struck the air like a commandment. Around them, passengers stilled. A soft gasp escaped from somewhere in row 4. Even Rennick hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by the unshakable calm in Kalen's tone. It was not defiance. It was not panic. It was control, complete, quiet control. But the hesitation didn't last. Rennick's lips curled into a dismissive sneer. "The child must be secured. It's for crew safety." His voice pitched louder now, meant to sound procedural, but something colder lingered underneath. Red Varson, the marshal, stood beside him like a sentry, arms crossed over his chest, expression unreadable. Not once did he look at the baby. Kalen didn't flinch. "You've seen the documents. He's medically exempt from abrupt repositioning. That restraint will compromise his airflow." Rennick ignored him. "Sir, comply or step aside." Kalen's eyes narrowed. He adjusted the strap on his shoulder slightly, feeling Laron shift with a soft whimper. The child stirred, his tiny chest rising unevenly, the whine of distress growing more audible. "Do not touch him again," Kalen said quietly. But Rennick had already made his decision. With a sharp jerk, he gripped the carrier's shoulder strap and pulled. The motion wrenched it from Kalen's body. Laron cried out, sharp, immediate, frightened. Kalen instinctively stepped forward, but Red blocked him with a well-placed arm, pressing him back with the force of law. "You will remain in your seat," Red said, not unkindly, but without invitation. "This is unlawful," Kalen replied, his voice tightening, not from rage, but from the raw edge of something far more dangerous, clarity, and medically reckless. Red didn't answer. Around them, passengers began to stir. A few stood. Phones quietly turned toward the aisle. The air felt thick, like the breath before lightning. Rennick turned and carried the screaming infant toward the front galley. Kalen's eyes followed every step. He noted the tilt of the carrier, the way Laron's head lolled sideways. The child's cries took on a rasped edge, and Kalen's stomach turned into a knot of cold steel. Then Rennick did the unthinkable. He placed the carrier in a narrow corner between the galley wall and a storage cabinet, a space barely wide enough to hold luggage, let alone a child. One hand held the carrier still, the other fed the zip tie through a metal bracket and around the carrier's plastic handle. The zipping sound was sharp, final. The makeshift restraint was tight. Kalen's breath caught. Red stood firm beside him. "You're escalating this," the marshal said. "No," Kalen replied, never breaking eye contact with his son across the aisle. "He is." The crying grew louder, sharper, until it fractured into hiccuped sobs. Kalen's hands clenched. His thoughts raced, not toward panic, but toward logistics. Angles, timing, pathways. He scanned the aisle, noted the gap between seats, measured the marshal's stance. He was no longer a passenger. He was a strategist standing in enemy territory. His eyes returned to the galley corner. He could see the zip tie's pressure bowing the carrier's frame slightly inward. Laron's face was flushed. He was still conscious, but the sound of his breath had changed, shallower, faster. Kalen's heartbeat didn't quicken. It steadied. Every second tightened a new thread inside him, pulling taut around a single, relentless truth. They had placed his child in a cage. The passengers didn't speak, but they watched. A man 2 rows back whispered something to his partner. A younger man raised his phone a little higher. Another slid into the aisle, pretending to reach for a bag, but his eyes stayed locked on the galley. Rennick turned once, as if to check his work. He caught Kalen's gaze and held it. There was no apology in the attendant's face, only certainty, warped by the intoxication of authority. Red finally exhaled beside Kalen. "He's not in danger. He's just upset." "No," Kalen murmured. "He's restrained in a way that compromises airflow. The tension on the carrier's base tilts his diaphragm. You'll have a chance to explain that after landing," Red replied mechanically. Kalen didn't respond. His eyes tracked the ceiling panel. He knew this aircraft class, knew the sequence of cabin lights, knew where the system wiring intersected with compliance panels. Every sound, every vent, every warning chime. He'd written code to interpret these things. Irony burned behind his sternum. They were using one of his own systems to justify what they were doing. He turned slightly, watching which crew member stood where. Rennick was beginning to pace. Red shifted his weight, sensing something brewing, but not quite naming it. Kalen closed his eyes for half a second. When he opened them, it wasn't with rage. It was with precision. He whispered once, not to anyone else, but to himself, calm, steady, final. "I warned him once, and only once." It was the moment the father's restraint turned into a silent promise of retribution. Kalen stood perfectly still, his son's cries echoing like sharp alarms through the pressurized silence of the cabin. Laron was zip-tied to a galley rail in the corner, a space meant for carts and equipment, not for infants. The image was absurd and horrifying, yet real. Dozens of eyes flicked between the sobbing child and the man who had placed him there, Rennick Thale, who now stood near the galley with arms crossed, breathing heavily, eyes scanning the passengers as if waiting for a confrontation he could use as further justification. Every nerve in Kalen's body screamed to act, to tear through the aisle, to break the restraint, to reclaim his son. But he didn't. He inhaled once, then turned without a word and walked back to his seat. A wave of confusion rolled through the passengers. A man near Rofer muttered under his breath, What's he doing? Red, still posted near the aisle, frowned and stepped slightly forward, as if preparing to block him again, but Kalen did nothing provocative. He simply sat down. To anyone else, the act might have seemed like surrender, but Kalen's eyes told a different story, steady, unblinking, calculating. He reached down slowly, slid open the zipper of his sleek leather satchel, and removed a cylindrical object no longer than a pen. He turned it on beneath the tray table with a faint vibration. It came to life with a low, internal pulse. The lights dimmed for a fraction of a second, coincidence to some, but not to him. It was a wand, non-invasive, undetectable to crew, used by systems engineers to detect hidden signal interference and electromagnetic anomalies. But in the right hands, it could do more, much more. Kalen leaned back slightly, tilting the device just enough to begin scanning beneath the seat through the wall panel and toward the floor conduits. A soft chime buzzed on his smartwatch. The wand had begun mapping. His eyes flicked toward the cabin ceiling where small, discrete nodes blinked in rhythm, part of the same core flight infrastructure he had designed years ago. At the time, he had been proud. Now he was grateful. This aircraft still ran on a modified version of his original diagnostic blueprint. Lines appeared on his watch, an internal schematic overlaid in real time. Power relays, crew intercom junctions, and door lock control hubs populated the interface in quiet sequence. The crew didn't know it, but their plane was giving up its secrets, line by line. From behind, a man with salt and pepper hair leaned toward another father and whispered, "That man's going to do something. I don't know what, but something." Two rose up. Another passenger discreetly typed on his phone, attaching a video clip of the crying baby and sending it to a news contact with a caption, "Mid-air restraint. No warning. Something's wrong." Kalen didn't look up. His hands moved with quiet certainty. He mapped 3 major relay junctions lighting PA override and rear cabin locks. He noted a latency gap in the left galley intercom, perfect for injecting a loop command later. His expression didn't change, but a flicker of resolve passed across his eyes. The very system that had tried to isolate him was now offering him a map of its own vulnerabilities. Back in the front galley, Rennick paced tightly, his fingers tapping nervously against the service panel. "Is he being detained or not?" He snapped at Red, who had been watching Kalen quietly from afar. Red's tone was flat. "Not yet. He hasn't violated any direct command." "Well, he's planning something," Rennick muttered. "You can feel it. He's too calm." Red shrugged. "Maybe he's just giving up." But even his voice lacked conviction. The quiet control Kalen exhibited was unsettling. Not the kind of surrender a man showed when defeated, but the quiet of someone letting a trap close before slipping through it. Further up the aisle, a young compliance supervisor in row 2 received a ping on his cabin tablet. A flagged anomaly in passenger grid 12F. He glanced toward Kalen's seat, brows furrowing. The alert wasn't for behavior. It was an internal systems flag, routing irregularity detected in subsystem diagnostics. He frowned but hesitated. Protocol dictated he reported to the crew, but something in the cabin's charged air made him pause. Kalen glanced down at his wrist. The interface shimmered with a pulsing light. He now had temporary access to 4 non-critical system nodes. Just enough to prepare. But he didn't act yet. Timing was everything. Mistiming a move would justify every false claim Rennick had made. From behind, another passenger whispered, "Why hasn't the marshal done anything yet?" "Because he doesn't understand who he's dealing with," came the quiet reply from the older man. "That's not just a father. That's a system designer. You see his wristwatch." The first man nodded slowly. "Custom OS. No latency." The old man nodded back. "He built this bird." Kalen's eyes never left the screen. His son's cries had softened, replaced by irregular whimpers, fatigue overtaking fear. But Kalen knew the risk wasn't over. The zip tie had distorted the carrier's angle. If Laron's neck shifted into the wrong position, even slightly, it could compromise his already fragile airflow. Not yet, he told himself. Just a little longer. The murmurs had grown now. Quiet ripples of awareness moving through the cabin. Passengers shifted, moved bags from under their seats, angled their cameras more openly. They didn't stand. Not yet, but the tide was turning. Kalen tapped twice on his watch to log the event. A green indicator blinked on the device's side. System scan complete. Internal relay pathways aligned. All he needed now was a spark, a manufacturer fault, a redirected trigger, something to make them move. And when they moved, he would too. Back in the galley, Rennick pulled Red aside again. "I think we need to act." But the marshal hesitated. His confidence had faded. His authority, once absolute, now felt precarious. "We don't move until he gives us cause." Rennick's eyes narrowed. He already did. He refused compliance. "Not by force," Red said flatly. "If we move without cause and something goes wrong." "You're afraid," Rennick snapped. "That man's playing us." But Red didn't respond. His silence spoke volumes. At his seat, Kalen clicked off the wand and slid it back into his satchel with surgical precision. On his watch, a single line of text appeared, pulsing gently. "Command node ready." He didn't smile. He didn't breathe a word. He simply watched and waited. They thought they had taken control. They thought silence meant surrender. They thought a zip tie was stronger than a system. But Kalen was no ordinary father. Because the moment they zip-tied his son, they forgot to check whose plane they were flying. The lavatory chime let out a delayed trill, 2 seconds too late. The flickering light above the galley dimmed for a breath before returning to full glow. Red Var's son barely noticed, but Kalen did. Sitting rigidly in seat 3A, his wrists hovered just above the tray table, eyes locked on the interface of his smartwatch. The diagram on the screen pulsed faintly in his peripheral vision, an internal systems map of Flight 907. The reroute was working. In the galley, Rennickvale leaned close to Red, whispering smugly. He backed down. "Knew we'd win this." Red gave a faint nod, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But Kalen, from his angle, caught the briefest flicker of doubt across the marshal's face, a hesitation that said, maybe this was going too far. Still, Red said nothing. Silence was his badge, but not for much longer. Kalen's thoughts raced. His son, Laron, was crying again, no longer sharp, protesting wails, but something thinner, more troubling. A rasp. He checked the carrier's oxygen flow readout, discreetly from his watch. The levels had dropped. Not catastrophic yet, but the angle of the zip tie had begun pinching the line. His son's airway was compromised. A sharp twist knotted in Kalen's stomach. He stood, deliberate, calm. The cabin murmur stilled again, passengers feeling the atmosphere change. One man, middle-aged, bald, seated 2 rows behind, nudged the man beside him and whispered, "He's not done." Another passenger, a younger man in a tech hoodie, angled his phone to get a better view, recording everything silently. Red moved forward again, a quiet barrier. "Return to your seat," the marshal said flatly. Kalen didn't raise his voice. Instead, he lifted his left hand and activated a holographic panel midair. The image projected clearly enough for the nearby rows to see, an official waiver glowing in sterile blue, marked with the seal of the National Transit Medical Authority. Under Clause 9-12B, Kalen said with calm precision, medical restraint or interference is prohibited during registered transit unless cleared by 2 flight-certified specialists. Red hesitated. That clause wasn't common knowledge, but it wasn't a bluff either. The projection shimmered with real-time verification tags. "He's making that up," Rennick scoffed from behind. "It's a bluff." But a voice rose from row 2. "He's right," said an older man with a gravel voice and the bearing of someone who had worn a uniform. Clause 9-12B. I flew with it for 20 years. Rennick froze mid-step. The tension in the aisle rippled. Something invisible shifted. Power, one squarely in the crew's hands, was beginning to leak outward into the cabin itself. Authority no longer felt centralized. It felt distributed. Kalen wasn't finished. He tapped his watch again. Below the cabin, in the aircraft's rear cargo bay, a small pressure node briefly tripped, a silent alarm he had redirected with a coded delay loop. A screech-like tone echoed faintly through the back intercom, startling even the junior attendant Jaren, who flinched from his seat near the service galley. What was that? Rennick barked, turning sharply. Sensor fault, Red muttered. Rear bay, maybe a bin shift. Check it, Rennick said quickly, already moving toward the rear. It was the first time he'd stepped away from Laron since the restraint. Kalen exhaled through his nose. He took a single measured step forward. His mind mapped every detail. Flight log syncing to the Clearsky node on his cloud drive, passenger cameras recording multiple angles, every movement syncing to the biometric timestamp within Laron's carrier. He wasn't improvising. He was documenting, coordinating. Red looked toward him again. His posture didn't change, but his eyes held something new. Calculation, apprehension, as if realizing the man he was attempting to restrain didn't just know the rules. He might have written them. Kalen didn't blink, and in that moment, he thought, taking another step, the leash they thought they'd place around him slipped quietly from his neck. The zip tie had begun to dig deeper into the carrier's side straps, forcing it into an unnatural tilt against the corner bulkhead. Laron's breathing, once soft and steady, had grown uneven, wet gasps breaking into shallow exhales. The sound twisted something in Kalen's chest, but he didn't flinch. Not yet. Passengers noticed. Whispered conversations rippled like the rustle of dry leaves before a storm. Men exchanged uneasy glances. A few subtly slid their bags out from under their seats, shifting them closer to their feet as though preparing for something, anything, that might come next. None of them moved openly, but the cabin was no longer passive. The air had thickened. Rennick returned from the cargo check, panting lightly, face flushed. No issue in the cargo, he muttered to Red with a dismissive wave of his hand, not realizing that his errand had been a diversion. Kalen didn't acknowledge his return. He remained seated, his back straight, his fingers moving with precision as he recorded a quiet message into the side of his pen. Laron Ryden, 6 months old, restrained unlawfully. Engaging documented override per flight compliance regulation veil 44D. His voice was low, but each word clipped and deliberate. He paused, encrypted the file, and transmitted it to 2 addresses, one stored in a private cloud reserved for emergencies, the other hardwired to a legal vault triggered by biometric ID. Insurance for what might happen next. He closed his eyes for a beat. When they reopened, they no longer held restraint. They held calculation. Kalen stood, careful not to show urgency. He took 2 quiet steps forward, toward the front galley in the small, silent corner where his son's breathing had turned to short, whimpering gasps. "I'm retrieving my son," he said evenly. Red placed a firm hand against his chest. "You move again and I will detain you." Kalen nodded once, absorbing the threat without breaking focus. He didn't argue. Instead, he turned his head slightly, raising his voice just enough to carry without shouting. "Passengers of Flight 907, may I have your attention?" The murmur fell to stillness. Seat back stopped shifting. Devices stilled. A few hands holding phones rose quietly, uncertainly, then with more intent. "My son," Kalen continued, voice steady as a metronome, "is being restrained without medical clearance, in violation of Airway Safety Code 44D. I am invoking protective override protocol. You are witnessing the event." The silence fractured with the sound of camera apps clicking into record mode. Rennick surged forward. "Do not listen to him. He's creating." But his voice collapsed under the weight of a dozen lenses and the calm resolve of a man no longer willing to explain himself. Kalen took another step. Red mirrored him, hand twitching toward the restraint loop on his belt. Clang. The lavatory door beside the marshal slammed shut with a sharp metallic snap, locking in place. The sound echoed like a dropped verdict in a courtroom. Red jerked around, confused, fumbling at the panel. Kalen didn't stop. He walked straight past him, past Rennick's shouted protests, past the gaping silence of the junior attendant, until he reached the corner. Laron was trembling softly, his cheeks red, lips parted as if crying had become too tiring. The carrier's angle had forced his chin against his chest. The zip tie, taut and crude, clung to the frame like a noose. Kalen kneeled. With a controlled breath, he removed the pen from his pocket, twisted the cap. The filament edge hissed softly to life, a cutting wire designed to slice through reinforced paper shielding. It had never been used for this. He guided it beneath the tie. One flick. Snap. The plastic restraint fell away. The carrier relaxed slightly, enough for air to pass properly again. Laron gasped and coughed, and his eyes fluttered open, dazed but awake. Kalen lifted his son gently, carefully adjusting the harness to avoid further stress. He pressed the boy to his chest, checking vitals on the embedded strip just beneath the fabric. Pulse stabilizing. Oxygen level rising. The cabin remained frozen. No one stopped him. No one dared. Even Red, now freed from the door's lock, didn't move forward again. His authority had crumbled not from force, but from foresight, from the calm unraveling of assumptions. Kalen turned and walked back toward his seat, one arm supporting Laron, the other steady at his side. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. But behind every passenger's widened eyes, behind every trembling phone camera lens, one truth settled with finality. Because in a world built on systems, the most dangerous man is the one who wrote them. The attendant smirked, certain he could shove the baby into a corner and zip-tie him unnoticed, unaware that the father had already risen with a calm fury that froze the aisle. If you believe cruelty disguised as procedure always folds when strategy meets power, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Silence hung in the air like a hell breath. Dr. Kalen Ryden stood in the narrow aisle, cradling his infant son, Laron, whose breathing, though shallow, had begun to steady now that the zip tie had been cut. The small sob slipping from the child's lips carried a different rhythm now. Not panic, but recovery. For a long second, no one on Flight 907 moved. A man in 4A slowly lowered his phone, eyes wide. Another, in 6C, exhaled audibly. The spell of paralysis among the passengers had broken, shifting from stunned compliance to quiet recognition. What had just unfolded wasn't an outburst. It was a surgical act of retrieval. Kalen's gaze didn't waver as he turned and walked with deliberate calm back toward his seat. Each step echoed louder than the ambient hum of the engines. The same aisle that a moment ago felt like a trap was now a corridor of quiet respect. Some passengers instinctively leaned away, not in fear, but in deference. A few nodded subtly. A soft clapping began from somewhere in the back, quickly hushed by the tension, but not before it was heard. Rennick Thale's face burned with disbelief. His jaw clenched, nostrils flaring. "Marshal, arrest him!" he barked, pointing with a hand that trembled too much to look authoritative. "He's endangered the crew and obstructed protocol." Marshal Red Varson, standing stiff near the galley door, didn't move. His arms remained crossed. His expression was unreadable, but it was no longer aligned with Rennick. He watched Kalen silently, eyes narrowing, mind-turning. Kalen reached his seat and gently eased down, never once loosening his grip on Laron. The baby clung to his father's collar, small fingers twitching, breathing in shorter wheezes, but with a visible return of color. Kalen looked down and adjusted the oxygen feeder, carefully repositioning the mask's flow vents. Then he spoke, not loudly, but with clarity that sliced through the cabin. "I am recording this transmission under Public Safety Statute 12X, he said. "The child's vitals were at risk. I acted lawfully." Rennick turned as if to scream another order, but a sharp chime interrupted. The pilot's voice crackled over the cabin speaker. "This is Captain Brandovar. I've been notified of a restraint incident involving a minor. Who had control of the situation?" The silence returned, but this time it was shaped by fear. Rennick stepped forward, shoulders puffed, and began, "Captain, this is Lead Attendant Rennick Thale." The father resisted compliance and compromised Saffet, but the voice that followed wasn't his. "Captain," Kalen said, eyes locked forward. "This is Dr. Kalen Ryden, founder of Core Flight Systems. The onboard restraint was unauthorized. I have recovered my son." The pause that followed was long. Every crew member in the galley froze. Red's head lifted slightly. A man from the front row whispered, "Did he just say Core Flight?" Rennick's eyes darted toward the cockpit door, his lips twitching in disbelief. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, unsure what to say now that his opponent had a name, and a terrifying one at that. The captain finally replied, voice sterner now. Acknowledged, standing by for legal debrief upon landing. In one sentence, the power dynamic of the entire flight collapsed. Crew members stiffened. The junior attendant, Jaron Vale, stood motionless, a tablet still in hand, the same one that flagged the erroneous compliance alert hours ago. He swallowed hard, recognizing the consequences of that single glitch. The man they had zip-tied wasn't just another overconfident passenger. He was the architect behind the very safety systems their airline relied on, their crew management dashboard, designed by CoreFlight, their risk matrix protocol, originally mapped by Kalen's team. The override modules, pressure locks, security nodes, all of it had traces of his signature code. The irony had become a sword. Red slowly returned to the cockpit, not saying a word, but giving Kalen one last glance. It wasn't defiant. It wasn't even ashamed. It was quiet, somewhere between regret and realization. Rennick turned sharply and disappeared into the galley, muttering to himself, eyes wide, skin pale. His once smug expression had unraveled into disbelief, as if the walls had betrayed him. Jaron slowly backed away, unsure where to stand anymore. Kalen didn't move. He didn't speak again. He simply stared ahead, calm as steel, Laron's head tucked safely beneath his chin, the infant's tiny breath warming the collar of his coat. Around them, the passengers sat in reverent quiet. No crew member approached. No threat loomed. Only the hum of flight that would soon end, and the knowledge that no one on board would ever forget what they'd just witnessed. They had touched the wrong child at the wrong time in the wrong father's arms. The plane jolted softly as its nose dipped into descent. The seatbelt signs blinked on with a chime that normally signaled routine, but nothing about this descent was routine anymore. The cabin buzzed with strange silence, the kind that thrums on the walls when everyone knows something went wrong, but no one dares say it. Rennick Thale stood alone in the galley, his shoulders tight, his face pale, his voice gone. A fellow crewman approached, whispered something in his ear. Rennick didn't resist. He simply nodded and was quietly ushered away from view, vanishing into the narrow crew corridor like a discarded variable in a miscalculated formula. Kalen sat still in his seat, Laron cradled gently against his chest, now wrapped once more in a carrier, not with straps and fasteners, but in a father's presence. The baby stirred weakly, but the cries had stopped, his breath softening, no longer choked by compression or fear. Kalen's expression remained unreadable. Not smug, not angry, just precise. Beside him, the air felt denser, as though even the pressurized cabin knew something irreversible had occurred. Across the aisle, Officer Redvarson had retreated into silence, arms folded, eyes no longer meeting Kalen's. He had nothing left to say, not to passengers, not to himself. Once, he might have explained away his inaction as protocol, compliance, chain of command, but now, all he had was the image of a child crying in a corner while he stood still. As the aircraft wheels met the tarmac with a heavy glide, there was no cheer, just the hush of reverse thrusters and the slow roll of inevitability. A discreet alert light flickered above the jet bridge latch. Passengers assumed it was a routine arrival queue. It wasn't. Two plainclothed officers, aviation compliance agents, stood outside waiting, their presence as calm and precise as Kalen's own demeanor. The door opened with familiar hiss, and they stepped aboard with quiet certainty, not looking left or right, not raising their voices. They didn't need to. Captain Bren Dovar exited the cockpit just as the first officer presented identification. He walked the aisle not like a man in charge, but like one who had just realized his plane had been the stage for something much larger than turbulence or delay. He approached Kalen directly. His voice, low and steady, carried both apology and recognition. "Dr. Ryden," he said, inclining his head, "I was not made aware of the full details until after the override was engaged." Kalen nodded once, holding his son closer. "Now you are." The captain turned and gave a silent signal to the officers. They didn't ask questions. They didn't argue. They moved directly to the galley where Rennick had been confined and escorted him down the aisle, not roughly, but with finality. No words. No cuffs. Just a kind of grip that says this is already over. Red remained seated, eyes forward, as one officer turned toward him and issued a firm instruction. Stay for debrief. He didn't argue. He couldn't. The authority in that voice wasn't just procedural, it was moral. As passengers began disembarking, something shifted. No one rushed for overhead compartments. No one pushed past. One by one, they passed by Kalen and slowed. A tap on the shoulder. A quiet thank you. A father paused, looked at Kalen, then looked down at Laron and murmured, "You did right. A boy," perhaps 6 or 7, tugged on his father's coat and pointed. "Is the baby okay now?" he asked, eyes wide. Kalen looked up, met the boy's gaze, and smiled softly. "He will be." Near the front of the cabin, just past the threshold where the jet bridge met the plane, a young man who had kept to himself during the flight stepped forward. He didn't speak at first. He simply reached into his coat, pulled out a flash drive, and held it out to Kalen. "Just in case they lose the footage," the man said, his voice calm but urgent. Kalen accepted it without hesitation, slipping it into an interior coat pocket near Laron's resting form. "Thank you," he said simply, the weight of his words landing heavier than the moment allowed. The terminal light streamed in soft gold through the cabin windows now. Afternoon in Norvale City was clear, the kind of sky pilots dreamed about. But inside, no one noticed the weather. They were watching a man walk to the aisle, not triumphant, not defeated, but like a storm had passed through him, and now all that remained was clarity. No cameras greeted him at the gate. No fanfare. No announcements. Just a door opening. Just a hallway ahead. As he stepped into the light, Kalen didn't look back. He didn't need to. Every passenger, every witness, every piece of footage would speak in his place. The echo of his steps faded into the terminal. The storm had passed, but the aftershocks were just beginning. Because some punishment are delivered not in rage, but in perfect, irreversible silence. The video surfaced quietly, posted without fanfare on a small aviation ethics forum known more for dry compliance debates than viral moments. Titled plainly, "Infant Restrained Midair Recorded Incident," it seemed at first like just another training clip. But within minutes, viewers caught the cry. A child's cry, sharp and muffled, followed by a calm voice saying, "Stop." The next few moments unfolded like a slow-motion collapse of authority. A flight attendant dragging a baby's carrier toward a wall panel, a marshal blocking the father, and then the unraveling, first by words, then by systems the crew never knew were built by the very man they had restrained. By the time the clip reached national media 3 hours later, the headline had changed. "Baby zip-tied midair. Father responds with measured fury." The article itself didn't name names, but the comments section did. That's Kalen Ryden. The founder of Core Flight? The guy who wrote the structural override protocols? The internet moved quickly. Screenshots from the plane, close-ups of the smartwatch grid, the phrase protective override protocol, all connected the dots. Regulators couldn't stay silent. The Federal Aviation Ethics Board released a statement before sunrise. An investigation is underway into a reported mid-flight restraint of an infant passenger aboard Aries Line Flight 907. Safety remains our top priority. It was clinical, cold, and completely unprepared for the storm that followed. In the homes of passengers who had witnessed the event firsthand, videos were already uploading. One man from Row 8 posted his own clip captioned, "He didn't raise his voice once, but he shut the system down." Another, a former pilot, wrote a lengthy post on how Kalen had quoted Airway Regulation 44D, with more precision than some crew chiefs I've worked with. Forums, news feeds, and ethics panels lit up. Meanwhile, in a glass-paneled boardroom atop Valorn Systems, Kalen's former company, the atmosphere grew tense. Aries Line was one of their partners. And Kalen, though absent for 2 years, had never fully released the architecture rights for their security overlay. One executive stared at the screen in disbelief. "He used a fail-safe node," he muttered. Another frowned. That was his old code, wasn't it? A third, voice low and uneasy, asked, "Do we still own it?" Valorn publicly released a short statement by midday. "We express our concern regarding the reported incident aboard Aries Line Flight 907 and reaffirm our commitment to passenger safety." But internally, there was panic. Not because of guilt, but because they realized Kalen still had influence, perhaps more than ever before. His silence in the years since leaving had always been unnerving. Now it felt like a warning fulfilled. Back in Norvale City, Kalen sat quietly in a small garden outside the pediatric clinic. Laron rested against his chest, breathing more easily after his treatment. He didn't scroll through the news. He didn't watch the videos. But he had seen enough. The flash drive from the young passenger sat unopened in his coat pocket. His phone buzzed with media requests, offers, demands for statements. He responded to none, except one. A single written message posted to a public aviation forum where anonymous engineers often debated ethics under pseudonyms. If safety systems are used as weapons, then we've failed not just passengers, but the idea of flight itself. The phrase traveled faster than the video itself. Regulators quoted it in briefings. Aviation training programs printed it on their revised manuals. One television anchor ended his segment by reading it aloud. Even rival CEOs began to reference it when pressured about internal policies. Meanwhile, Ares Line made its move. Rennick Thale, the flight attendant, was officially suspended. No ceremony, no statement. Just quietly removed from duty. Red Varsun, the onboard marshal, was placed on unpaid leave pending role clarification and review. But Kalen knew better. These weren't consequences. They were gestures, pressure valves released before public heat could boil over. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Inside a quiet room filled with schematic printouts and blank protocol charts, Kalen sat at a long table. He adjusted Laron's blanket gently, then slid a touchscreen terminal toward himself. Blue lines arced across the interface, flight data overlays, restraint authority trees, cabin compliance hierarchies. His eyes scanned them not as a man outraged, but as a man reprogramming. Not to punish, to prevent. The door opened behind him. An engineer entered, pausing when he saw Kalen. "I saw the clip," he said carefully. "I don't know how you stayed that calm." Kalen didn't look up. He tapped twice, zooming into a diagram of a carrier restraint system. "Some fathers don't yell," he said quietly, voice even and precise. "They restructured a system that allowed harm to exist." The hearing room fell into complete silence as the screen froze on a single, chilling frame. Laron's tiny face, eyes shut in discomfort, framed by a zip tie anchoring his carrier to a rail near the galley. A commissioner wiped at his cheek with the edge of a folded tissue, his hand trembling as he looked away from the monitor. The footage had played in full. The confrontation, the restraint, the cries of the infant and the father's calm defiance. The room held its breath, as if even the air understood the gravity of what had been shown. Kalen Ryden stood at the center of the semicircular floor, his posture unshaken. He didn't look at the audience. His eyes remained on the table in front of him, where a biometric data pad displayed Laron's oxygen levels from that flight, numbers that had dipped dangerously low during the restraint period, each data point time-stamped and verified. In the stillness, he reached forward and tapped the final screen, allowing the panel to see the carrier's vitals matched against the aircraft's own system logs. The red alert spikes were unmistakable. The child's airflow was compromised, Kalen stated quietly. At 32,000 feet, that's not discomfort. That's a threat to life. One of the commissioners, a tall man with weather hands and a silver tie pin, leaned forward. His voice was gravelly. "Dr. Ryden, are you suggesting that restraints on minors should be banned entirely?" Kalen lifted his gaze, calm but resolute. "I'm suggesting they should never be applied without dual-certified pediatric clearance, and only then under documented, time-limited conditions." He paused. "This is not about banning enforcement. It's about aligning enforcement with humanity." From the gallery behind him, quiet murmurs spread among the attending journalists and aviation regulators. The buzz of shifting pens and notepads signaled momentum. But Kalen knew better than to celebrate too soon. His role wasn't to win a moment. It was to structure a reform no one could undo. Over the following days, he moved precisely. He reconnected with 3 former engineers, Jensen Morick, Rill Dorn, and Hadrick Vale, whistleblowers he had once mentored. Each had been sidelined from smaller regional airlines after reporting crew misconduct, their findings ignored or buried in internal review. They now met in a quiet Norvale workspace Kalen, maintained for sensitive operations. Blueprints, footage, and policy drafts layered the walls. Jensen, thin and methodical, tapped on a touchscreen with calculated force. They used a secondary restraint pattern designed for cargo transport, he muttered. It was never meant for passengers, especially not children. And here, Rill added, pointing to a clause buried deep in a compliance manual, they use a code meant for emergency turbulence, not behavioral intervention. Hadrick said nothing, but opened a drawer and placed an old key card on the table. I never turned it in. Still accesses the regional training logs. Kalen nodded slowly, piecing the fragments together. We build from this. We call it the Laron Safeguard Act. Each word that followed was typed with absolute precision. The draft took shape over 4 days, blending technical language with emotional clarity. The final clause struck the balance Kalen needed. No restraint device shall be applied to any minor aboard commercial aircraft unless under documented authorization by 2 onboard pediatric certified personnel and recorded under dual verification log. Once the policy was solidified, Kalen uploaded the packet, footage, data, transcripts, proposed legislation, to the National Transit Safety Review Commission portal. He didn't wait for acknowledgement. Instead, he took the next step. He launched the Clearski protocol. The platform, built in under 48 hours with the help of an encryption specialist named Jarek Venn, allowed passengers to report incidents anonymously in real time. Kalen's only rule: data must include timestamped video or biometric proof. No rumors, only verifiable abuse. Within 3 days, the first 12 reports came in. By the end of the week, there were 40, each outlining similar instances of power misuse. Some described passengers with oxygen tanks forced to relocate mid-flight. Others cited parents told to silence children under threat of restraint. One log simply said, "My son coughed. They flagged him. He's asthmatic." Each entry was cataloged, analyzed, and forwarded to regulators. Meanwhile, Ares Line scrambled. Internal emails leaked. Emergency training modules were announced, rushed into circulation. PR statements followed. We are reviewing all protocols. We take passenger safety seriously. But the damage was done. The footage had reached millions. And now, passengers weren't just watching. They were reporting. At a press conference, a reporter asked the Transit Commission's chair, "What changed the momentum so quickly?" He replied without hesitation. A father quietly cut one zip tie and unraveled the entire illusion of in-flight power. Kalen didn't attend the press conference. He was already preparing the next phase. The aircraft system that restrained his child had been built for safety. It had been turned into a weapon. That truth would not be allowed to fade into silence. Because when justice flies quiet and straight, it strikes harder than any turbulence. The defamation filing landed like a final, desperate punch in an already collapsing fight. Rennick Thale, now under formal review by the Aviation Crew Conduct Tribunal, had filed it not through Ares Line's legal division, but independently, without the airline's knowledge. The document accused Dr. Kalen Ryden of character assassination and digital defamation through crowd manipulation. But the tribunal barely made it past the first page before calling for immediate evidentiary review. Within 48 hours, the defense had submitted the full flight footage, passenger testimony, and compliance transcripts, all synchronized, indexed, and time-stamped. It wasn't just airtight. It was clinical. A silent chill swept through the hearing room as the screen lit up, showing Rennick reaching toward the infant, his face taut with performative calm. Then the cries, the zip tie, the corner, the silence from the marshal, the refusal to de-escalate. As the footage played, Rennick sat in the review chamber with stiff posture, arms crossed as if trying to armor himself against the growing disgust in the room. But it wasn't just what the screen showed, it was what the tribunal didn't yet know. That came next. 3 former co-workers, all male, requested to speak. The first was Ellis Varn, a flight technician who'd worked a short stint under Rennick's supervision. His voice was measured but unmistakably bitter. He said things like, compliance is about dominance, not safety, not care, dominance. Then came Julian Merrick, a former junior attendant. He recounted how he had once refused to apply a restraint belt to a nonverbal autistic boy during a short-haul flight. Rennick had written him up. He told me I was weak, Julian said, his hands trembling slightly on the desk. He said, passengers like that need to learn we're in charge. Gasps didn't erupt in the chamber, but the silence that followed was louder than outrage. Rennick's defamation claim dissolved under the weight of his own words. One by one, each layer of credibility peeled away. He made no closing remarks. The tribunal offered him none. By the end of the week, his access credentials were revoked. Aries Line refused to comment. Rennick vanished from public sight like vapor in wind. But another hearing loomed. Red Varsun, the marshal who had stood at Rennick's side, now sat beneath the heavy LED lights of Federal Transport Oversight Committee's review board. 7 male panelists, veterans of air law and aviation safety, watched the same footage. Loop after loop, Kalen seated, Laron crying, Rennick acting, Red watching. Red tried to hold to his phrasing. I believed I was engaging in protective enforcement. My training emphasized deference to lead attendants in ambiguous situations. A tribunal member leaned forward. Did you not hear the child crying? I did. Did you examine the child's medical documents? No. Did you intervene when the child's breathing showed visible distress? I followed procedure. On the screen behind him, the video paused at the frame where Red stood motionless, arms crossed, as Rennick zip-tied the carrier to the galley rail. The silence after that question lasted a full 10 seconds. The verdict arrived with the weight of iron. Marshal certification revoked. Immediate surrender of badge and credentials. Outside the hearing room, reporters waited. Red exited through a back corridor. Not a single camera caught him. Meanwhile, in Norvale City, Kalen Ryden declined all interview requests. His days were filled with silent architecture, the kind that reshapes futures without ceremony. Through his innovation trust, Kalen channeled funds under Laron's name into an initiative that bore no visible branding. Quiet transfers, anonymous shell donors. But the results spoke volumes. New child-centered restraint research was commissioned. Modular carrier units with built-in oxygen sensors, stress detection foam linings, and crew alert systems calibrated to recognize infant distress patterns. Another branch developed predictive crew analytics using anonymized cabin interaction footage to detect patterns of escalating behavior, long before restraint became a question. Airlines across the continent received slim black kits labeled Aviation Sensory Package, Infant Class, with no sender's name. Inside, each package included a note, white card, silver ink, just a single line. This kit is a reminder. Restraint is only noble when it protects, never when it controls. No media statement, no press release, just a whisper of a new standard slipping through the system like a breath through clean airflow. Aviation blogs tried to trace the kit's origin, but hit dead ends. The truth remained hidden beneath layers of nonprofit partnerships and blind trusts. Yet those who worked in the field knew. A quiet voice was shaping a louder change. And far away from it all, in a quiet office with no nameplate, Kalen sat alone, watching a test animation of a new carrier module folding into place with a soft click. Laron's name was encoded in the prototype model. He didn't need anyone to know, because he had already spoken. Once. Just once. And sometimes, the sharpest retaliation is a better blueprint. The mural appeared without fanfare. No ribbon, no podium, no speeches. Only a quiet unveiling in the east wing of Norvale's Skyport Terminal, near Gate 47, with a morning light filtered to the tall glass panes and slow golden beams. It shimmered on the polished tiles, tracing the outlines of a new painting, one that made passers-by slow their steps, unsure why their breath caught. A father, faceless and painted in graceful silhouette, held a child against his chest with one arm. The other hovered above a control panel etched in faint lines, neither touching nor turning, only sensing. Behind them, a swirl of cloud-like chaos dissolved into a calm gradient of blue and white, turbulence fading into stillness. Beneath it, bolted into steel, was a plaque with a single quote carved into the surface. Systems are tested not by how they operate, but by who they silence. Kalen Ryden read the words once and did not need to read them again. He stood before the mural, unnoticed, just another father in the stream of travelers moving through the terminal. Laron, heavier now but still light in Kalen's arms, slept soundly in the soft carrier, his head turned gently against his father's chest. The soft mechanical pulse of the child's breathing monitor blinked green to the mesh, slow and steady. Kalen didn't pause for long, just long enough. Behind him, the echo of trolley wheels scraped the floor. A man in maintenance, coveralls passed by without looking up. A younger crew trainee slowed, drawn in by the quote, his lips moving as he whispered the line aloud. Not far away, a passenger who had been idly scrolling his phone stopped, lifted the device, and took a photo. A moment later, he posted it with a simple caption. One man's calm changed everything. Kalen didn't glance back. His stride remained unbroken, footsteps soft but certain. The storm had come and gone. The winds had shifted, and though the world continued moving around him, there were new protocols now, silent but powerful things that had taken root. He passed the security checkpoint without friction. No questions about the carrier. No second glances. One of the guards even nodded respectfully, though it was likely more instinct than recognition. At home, the apartment was still quiet. Laron stirred only once as Kalen removed the carrier and laid him gently into the cradle, where a familiar lullaby tone played from the corner. The baby's eyes blinked open for a second, then closed again. Breathing unrestricted, easy-free, Kalen walked into his study, a glass room that overlooked the edge of Norvale skyline. The air was cool. His tablet rested on the desk, already pulsing with waiting notifications, press requests, requests for commentary, interviews, op-eds. He dismissed them all. Instead, he opened a new document. At the top of the screen, in bold gray font, he typed, Preliminary Draft, Crew Training Optimization Protocol. His fingers hovered for a moment before moving again, this time steady, fast, certain. He wrote not from anger, but precision. The new guidelines emphasized situational discernment, psychological profiling, pediatric compliance structure, and the inclusion of voice escalation thresholds. He knew none of it would make headlines, but he also knew that reforms rarely begin with explosions. They begin with silence, with action, with restraint that bends into structure. As he typed, the footage from Flight 907 had already been requested by the Civil Aviation Ethics Council for integration into federal-level training simulators. Kalen had signed the release form the day before without publicity, without hesitation. Outside, clouds drifted slowly past the sun. Somewhere across the country, a young crew manager reviewed a checklist that now included a new column titled Child Restraint Clearance, Dual Officer Sign-Off Required. At an airfield in Wenton, a startup announced a prototype carrier harness with oxygen-sensitive buckling, a design already embedded with Kalen's private funding. And in a lecture hall in Farron City, a group of flight cadets debated what defined compliant authority, reading lines from a new internal policy titled the Laron Clause. Kalen kept writing. Not far from him, Laron shifted in the cradle, stretching out one hand, unconsciously reaching. Kalen turned, watching him with quiet eyes. The child's breath rose and fell without interruption. No cords, no ties, no fear. Outside the window, the city hummed forward as always, cars, trains, blinking towers. But here, in this quiet corner, a man typed in peace. No need for fire, just the architecture of protection rebuilt line by line. He would never be able to undo what happened. But he could make sure the same moment never happened again to another child, another parent, another plane. And that was enough for now. He glanced once more at the open document, then saved the draft and closed the screen. Behind him, a soft exhale came from the cradle, the kind that only came from peace. Because once they zip-tied his child in silence, and now the whole world listens. Seconds later, the father's retaliation made the entire crew step back in silent shock. The attendant who ignored a single warning found himself overpowered, exposed, and facing consequences that unraveled the moment those ties were misused. If you believe real authority protects the innocent with precision, control, and decisive force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, abuse of authority, and the importance of listening to warnings before harm escalates. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke thought, and inspire conversations about accountability, empathy, and protecting the vulnerable.